Hello, everybody. Welcome to New Plaza. We're a nonprofit community of film lovers. And today, as Lori said, Gary Palmucci, our curator, has chosen the suspenseful 1942 film Saboteur, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and starring Robert Cummings and Priscilla Lane. The discussion will be led today by Gary and by his good friend, the wonderful film historian, Max Alvarez. Thank you for coming. And Gary, please begin.
Thank you, Norma, and hello, everyone. It's great to be back on the air here after what for me was nearly a 2-month break. I'm reading from a teleprompter today. This is a new experience. Max Alvarez and Dan Cahill did a terrific job in late June dissecting Alan J. Pakula's masterful Klute. And today the three of us will delve into Alfred Hitchcock's 1942 Saboteur, which I finally saw in its entirety for the first time back at the 2010 TCM Classic Film Festival in LA. And back then, as now, I think it's one of Hitchcock's truly undervalued titles. Full of pungently written scenes, memorable supporting players, and a fascinating backstory. It feels like his first truly American film, despite actually being the 5th one shot and financially backed here, starting in 1940. Now, Max, the trailer you dug up today isn't one of Hitchcock's personally hosted ones, which he later became, as he enunciated it, notorious for. But it does pack a fair amount of mayhem into 95 seconds.
It does, and it has a curious aspect of having footage created just for the trailer with Robert Cummings addressing the camera, sort of breaking down what we call the fourth wall. So let's take a look at the original Universal Pictures release for Saboteur in 1942.
I'm Barry Kane, American. Right now, I'm a fugitive. A couple of days ago, I was an aircraft worker. Then something happened. My best friend died in that fire. The authorities questioned everybody. I told them what I knew.
There were 2 detectives here a moment ago. They wanted to arrest you. They said that you killed him.
You don't know what it is to be hunted like an animal. To dread every door you open. To fear everybody. Even the one girl you could love.
Even if a man committed murder to defend himself, maybe I wouldn't tell the police. But there's only one reason why a man commits sabotage. That's worse than murder.
We fled through 3,000 miles of terror from Los Angeles to New York. Step by step, the whole vast pattern of sabotage became clear to us. We had to find those saboteurs. Well, we found them, and we almost wish we hadn't.
Before they get to us, go out and stop the music. Tell them all.
Honey, this is the Sutton Mansion. I'm just a guy from Glendale, California, wanted by the police. They'll grab me as soon as I open my mouth.
What are you going to do? We can't just stand here.
Perspective, there was a reference when the title comes up that says it can't happen here. Clearly that was a reference to the Sinclair Lewis best-selling novel that MGM was too sheepish to bring to the screen around this time or earlier, which was dealing with the threat of fascism in the United States.
Well, interestingly, in the film, Max, we never hear the words Germany or Japan uttered, at least that I noticed. It's unusually muted in the sense of, and we talked about this the other day. There's even a little bit of like kind of self-criticism of certain schools of thought or behavior among Americans at this time. The actor playing the blind man where Robert Cummings briefly takes refuge early in the film. He's, kind of questioning the whole American spirit or attitude toward the war in ways that I'm sure very, very few studio films did at that time.
Absolutely. This is, and I would say that just about all of Hitchcock's wartime films fall into the somewhat category of cynical. It's pretty cynical for a wartime spirit-raising picture. The villains, I mean, especially Freeman. Freeman is almost somewhat comical, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you're absolutely right. Where what I find, and I think this is what makes Hitchcock's pictures endure a little longer, is that he touched on topical political issues, but he wasn't too specific. Like Germany and Japan are not mentioned, just as Soviet Union was not mentioned in North by Northwest. And I think that it's that way we focus on the intrigue, the suspense, and the suspense in the situations.
It may be that they had to scramble too in doing some of the many rewrites of the script. I know you have a copy there on your desk somewhere, one of the original drafts of the screenplay, which is dated in the fall of 1941. I was trolling around and I happened to notice a document of Robert Cummings being involved in a lawsuit against Universal Pictures a couple of years later. And they had a list of every day that he had worked for the studio, including his work on Saboteur. And he didn't, according to that document, work his first day until December 17th, 1941, 10 days after Pearl Harbor. So they may have either decided not been able to introduce any aspect of that into the story, or perhaps just decided to play it cool, which I think was a smart move here.
Fascinating, because this script that I have is dated October 30th, 1941. So it's almost a week before Pearl Harbor. Yet what's fascinating is it follows
I think
film.
Actually 6 weeks, Max, because at December 7th, I believe.
Oh, yes. Hello. Thank you. I'm glad somebody here is paying attention to these things, Gary. Thank you.
I remember it well.
Can we do a retake? No, we're live. We can't. So, all right. So it's well before Pearl Harbor. But however, the villain played by Otto Kruger in the screenplay has a Japanese maid who speaks broken English when the Robert Cummings character arrives. Obviously, that has been changed for the film. The film would have been had it really been given a dated air if they had stuck with that originally. And however, some of the changes that were made to make it more politically almost propagandistic were subtle changes in the dialogue. The blind uncle, for example, in the film, he says, "It's my duty as an American citizen to presume a man innocent until he's proven guilty." Whereas in the script, he just says, like so many people nowadays, "You're judging a man before he's been proven guilty." So there were little cases where they tweaked a few words here and there to give it more of a propagandistic oomph, I guess you could say.
Well, some of our colleagues here actually first put us on the idea of using Saboteur on the program, because this is I believe, the centennial of Dorothy Parker, the famous columnist and general all-American wit. Although her name does not appear on that particular draft of the script that you have, right?
No, it's very strange, because obviously she's credited in the film, and Hitchcock, who we know was not always generous talking about his collaborators, did credit her with a lot of elements of the narrative. However, the script I have, we have credited as the writers are Hitchcock, Joan Harrison, and Peter Vertel. And yet Parker's input is said to be the truck driver who picks up Robert Cummings along the way, the circus workers who each represent, the Axis
possibly
powers.
The high point of the screenplay for many of us.
Right. So the circus workers who represent FDR, Hitler, divided European nations, and then also the blind uncle. Yet all those characters and situations appear in the script, although Parker is not credited on it. There were some little cryptic bits of business that appeared in the film, but not in the script version that I have. But Hitchcock credited a lot of that to her.
As you and Dan Cahill were discussing the other day in our rehearsal, this was going to be a Selznick production originally, and John Houseman, who famously worked with Orson Welles, was involved in some kind of production capacity, which is how Norman Lloyd got involved he's kind of the the unsung hero of the piece here, as we're going to discuss.
Norman Lloyd, who we just lost this year, 106, Gary, is that right?
Yes, 106. I
As
have a
Fry,
couple of passages hopefully have time to read later, written by our friend Todd McCarthy there, the trade journalist who knew Norman Lloyd well and was at his birthday party every year up until this year, which was his final one. And Lloyd had one of the most incredible American lives that I've ever heard, at least in show business.
and Film Forum, as Dan mentioned recently, is doing or continuing a salute to Norman Lloyd. That's going to be coming up in connection with their documentary, The Women Behind Hitchcock. But you're right about the Houseman did develop the script at the beginning with Hitchcock at Selznick, but Hitchcock was eager to get away from Selznick. He was under contract to him, and so he pitched it around town. Universal took it, but Robert Cummings' character is named Kane, and that is an in-joke to Citizen Kane. And it wasn't until I resaw the film recently that I finally could understand what Fry was shouting as he fell from the Statue of Liberty torch.
True.
Kane.
That's
So
true.
it was the Houseman influence.
Well, this might be a moment to read one of the paragraphs here from Todd McCarthy's piece. It said, Norman Lloyd, of course, who plays the Saboteur Fry and has the climactic scene at the top of the Statue of Liberty that Dan's going to dissect for us shortly. He says, Norman Lloyd's big regret was not having stuck around in Hollywood long enough to act in Citizen Kane. When Wells's original RKO project, based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, was canceled, he asked his actors to remain in Hollywood for a few weeks while he settled on a new production. Norman, however, was talked into returning to New York by a friend who said there were some big opportunities in radio at the moment. It remained the biggest regret of Norman Lloyd's career, and Orson Welles never forgave him, although they did have a reunion after a fashion when they met at a Directors Guild event not long before Orson Welles died in 1985. It's widely believed that if Norman had stayed in Hollywood and been cast in Kane, he would have been given the role of Bernstein, played in the end by Everett Sloane, who delivered that poignant monologue about how he would never forget the young woman he saw getting off a ferry. I'm sure most of us remember that scene.
That's really amazing. And Lloyd is going to have there's a bit of a circular narrative in his career because he's going to return working for Hitchcock in the mid to late 50s for Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He will produce many of the episodes. He's going to switch off with Joan Harrison in that capacity, and he'll even be directing several outstanding episodes as well.
I think also, as we may get into in a couple of weeks, he managed to dodge the blacklist with some help from Hitchcock.
Yes, he was, I guess you could say he was gray listed by the 1950s, and Hitchcock did give him a chance and brought him at least into television. So he was helpful in that regard. The Fry character is certainly one of the more menacing of the villains because Freeman, as I mentioned, he's somewhat of a comic figure. There's the scene in the back of the car where he's talking to Cummings about his son and how he doesn't want to cut the boy's hair, and very bizarre. And the most disturbing part of it is not in the screenplay. I'm wondering if Dorothy Parker stuck this in later, where he says, when I was a child, I had long golden curls. People used to stop on the street to admire me. And this is then followed by, as they're traveling to New York, by the other villains singing Tonight We Love in the car. That was not in the script. It was just insane. So the film has these really bizarre, it's a bizarre structure where part of it almost seems that Hitchcock and others are just having fun and not taking it too seriously.
Well, the fact that we're talking about all these ephemeral characters, I think, proves the point that, every time I rewatch a Hitchcock film, I go back and take a look at the great book, Hitchcock Truffaut. I imagine you do too. Yeah. And Hitchcock really makes the point, kind of downplaying all the good things in Saboteur, that to him, the weak link was the lack of real movie star charisma in the two leading characters, Bob Cummings and Priscilla Lane, as opposed to, say, Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint in North by Northwest, which is a very similar picture to Saboteur in some ways, or even Robert Donat and Madeline Carroll in the 39 Steps. You don't care about them as much because they don't have that movie star charisma that engages us quite the same way. Not that they're bad, but they're not in the same league.
No, absolutely. And apparently Joel McCrea was considered very early on because they had worked together, Hitchcock and he, on Foreign Correspondent, but he was not available. Hitchcock also wanted Henry Fonda and Barbara Stanwyck. Boy, that would have been a different picture, wouldn't it?
All I can hear is the line "Snakes are my life." You know, when those
Yeah,
two actors are mentioned in the same sentence.
exactly. And so you have Robert Cummings, who had come from Broadway and then had been in Hollywood since 1935, generally known for light romantic parts. Priscilla Lane, who was the youngest of the three Lane sisters, who had been touring as vocalists for Fred Waring's Pennsylvanians. They arrived in Hollywood in the late 30s, were immediately signed to a Warner's contract. And she also tended to be assigned more light parts than something, for example, like Saboteur. Although my personal favorite is the Raoul Walsh film she was in called The Roaring Twenties, which was 3 years earlier. But so yeah, they're not normally the kind of people we would see in a film of this type, which I think impacted the tone, because you do have dramatic parts, but then there's this whimsicality to a lot of the proceedings that we can argue more about.
Right. I'm just a fellow from Glendale, California, as he says in the trailer there. I'm not sure that I guess that line kind of both is sends up his character, and then on the other hand, kind of, you know, puts it out there in terms of the lack of gravitas in his performance.
Yes, and to continue what you were talking about, this is kind of taking a lot of the elements of the 39 steps, even right down to the handcuffs, but it could be considered a dress rehearsal or an early draft of North by Northwest. And you can see with the casting and the script, they were able to strengthen and eliminate some of the weaknesses and create a more solid narrative.
Mount Rushmore eventually replacing the Statue of Liberty at the climax.
Precisely, and I know Daniel is going to be with us to talk more about the visual elements of Saboteur, and a couple of things that stand out for me, and I know Dan will talk about others. But for example, Hitchcock was known for his point of view shots, and the one that stands out is when the Robert Cummings character, he's dived off the bridge and the detectives are pursuing him, and we see a point of view shot from underwater at one of the detectives who's standing above ground, and that's a great Hitchcockian moment. The shootout in Radio City Music Hall, which they had to downplay, and I think Daniel may tell us more about that. There's the movie within the movie, which is a full frame, a great close-up of the actress in the movie that the audience is watching, and then you see Norman Lloyd's Fry silhouette at the very bottom firing a gun. It's just a great image.
We were debating whether that was some Universal B picture, you know, that they used a few clips from, but I think now I accept your explanation that was probably shot specifically for the scene.
Yeah,
that's really the only way it could have made any nonsense, I think, in that case.
It's true, and I think, and I can't recall in the script if it refers to the audience watching a comedy suspense movie in the cinema, but it's not played. The movie within the movie is played very seriously, and the audience is laughing and laughing at the danger being presented towards the heroine. I thought that was a fascinating, kind of a cynical touch of the movie going.
A lot of location shooting for a Hollywood studio film of that kind too, and from coast to coast.
For some there were some location second unit work done. For example, with the trip to Liberty Island, you had Norman Lloyd and Priscilla Lane on location briefly, and then some quick shots of the statue, which of course then they rebuilt at Universal. Daniel, I think, will share some news about the bombed ship that we see. There's a story behind that.
Yes.
And also, it's the only Hitchcock movie, although it's very briefly at the beginning, it's the only one to be set in Los Angeles briefly. None of his other films, even though he lived in LA, he didn't set any of his narratives there for the most part.
Wasn't Family Plot, didn't that take place in LA?
You know, I think they refer to it as San Angeles because they don't quite explain. You see Los Angeles and then you see these hills of San Francisco because they filmed in both locations. But I believe they do reference LA. I think you're right on that.
Well, there's one other very funny location piece I noticed before we move over to Daniel. The very delightful and diabolical scene between Tobin and Robert Cummings and his granddaughter Susie early in the picture was and was filmed on a particular set on the Universal lot, and then 20 years later, Hitchcock used that very same house to film a scene from The Birds, also a Universal picture. And that house was originally used for a Deanna Durbin musical, apparently. And of course, she appeared in Christmas Holiday, which we once featured here on New Plaza Cinema. So 6 degrees of everything.
That's fantastic, because this was his first Universal picture. Of course, he's on loan out, and the studio was rather alarmed that he wanted to have 50 sets built for Saboteur, because he loved having things built. Even that waterfall set was built in the studio. But Daniel, I think, has some cost-cutting background on how Hitchcock was able to save some of the, at least trim some money off the budget. And Dan Cahill, who he has taught film, he's worked as a filmmaker, is going to now talk a little bit about the visual look of Saboteur and some of the memorable shots in the film. So Daniel, welcome back, and we can't hear what you have to say about Saboteur.
Fire away.
I'm muted, I think.
We can hear you. You're
Good.
perfect. We can hear you and see you.
Perfect. Yeah, I just want to say my mission today is a bit different from what I did with Clute, where I spent most of the time talking about Gordon Willis's cinematography. This time, although Joseph Valentine was certainly a high-grade cinematographer, in fact, Hitchcock wanted him, having seen his work on The Wolf Man with, what's his name, Lon Chaney Jr., soon before the film. And he really wanted Joseph Valentine. But Valentine's work is pretty much by the numbers here. So I'm going to be talking about the artifice that Hitchcock himself employed to create certain important narrative elements in the story. So here we go. I'm going to show you most of this in the order in which it appears in the film. This is one of the first shots as smoke billows out of the airplane factory. And this was a result of a misunderstanding, as Hitchcock and his new production designer, Robert Boyle, who later collaborated on some of their classic films, Hitchcock wanted to do a storyboard that showed the fire, and he drew a big squiggle. And Boyle misread that for smoke and designed the shot for this billowing smoke, which I think is quite fascinating. And it works on me. It gives me the creeps. This is one of the cost-cutting shots. This is the view from the back of the circus caravan as we're watching the police searching the caravan. You will note that only about the first 3 trucks that we see in the shot are actual life size, and those 3 people are actual life size people. Behind the trucks are paintings of medium-sized trucks and little people being placed in the frame to create a forced perspective. And in the far distance, it's kind of hard to see it on a small screen. On the big screen in a cinema, it would show up much more clearly. They used really, really tiny little cutout figures with flashlights that they could move around and arms that could move. This is at the famous social party in Manhattan at the Sutton House. Cummings and Lane, in this 2-minute dialogue scene that is uncut, are basically romancing and strategizing what they're going to do. And this was filmed all in one take, but using rear projection for all of the rest of the people at the party. This made the shooting much easier, possibly saved them some money, and it made it a lot easier to get both of the actors through 2 minutes of dialogue without having to stop all the time if somebody blew a line. This is a strange scene. This is the final confrontation between Tobin, played by Otto Kruger in this shot, and Robert Cummings, who we'll see in a moment. What I find so strange about this scene is that Hitchcock held on this long shot of Tobin's character, and note how tiny he is in the frame. Even the lamps in the room are taller than he is. By contrast, we see Robert Cummings in a standard dialogue medium shot. And I think Hitchcock probably filmed the same kind of shot for Otto Kruger, but decided not to use it because he wanted to diminish the man's importance in world politics and emphasize Barry Kane here, giving probably the only rousing pro-war speech where he says, "We will continue to fight you till the cows come home," a brilliant Americanism that they managed to work into that scene. This is the aforementioned Radio City Music Hall sequence with, you can see Fry's gun with far more smoke than I've ever seen come out of a handgun before. It almost mimics the smoke in that early frame I showed you at the aircraft factory. It's interesting to note that Radio City did not want its name used. They merely refer to it as the Music Hall in dialogue. And also, I don't know if it's a coincidence, it probably was, Radio City is where Saboteur premiered in Manhattan. Go figure. This is the aforementioned shot of the ship lying on its side. It is a stand-in for the ship that was exploded in the script at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In actuality, this is the French cruise liner Normandy, which had been repurposed as a troop ship, and it exploded after a fire and capsized in Manhattan. The minute Hitchcock heard about this event, which occurred during the shooting of the film, he sent a newsreel crew out to film the Normandy on its side, not just to film it, but to shoot it from a passing car. He knew exactly what he wanted to do with this shot, that he wanted to show Fry seeing his handiwork and smirking a little bit in a reaction shot. Here we are at the grand finale. This is the famous shot of Fry falling to his death from the Statue of Liberty's torch. Behind him is a matted in background. And here is the shot done in a studio with Norman Lloyd sitting on some sort of seat on a pole with nothing but black behind him. And the camera was above him, looking straight down on him. In order to create the illusion of him falling, they pulled the camera up and back from him rather quickly. So it gives the impression that he was falling to his death. And he was also, of course, waving his arms and yelling "Kane," as we know. They probably dubbed that in later. That's the end of my visual analysis, but I have to point out there are two other scenes which Max alluded to weird stuff in this movie. These are probably my two favorite weird scenes. They both take place in the Midtown office building where they're holding Pat captive. And we see Freeman, the guy who had the long golden curls as a little boy. He's talking with one of the thugs who is supposedly watching over Pat. Note that the aforementioned thug is darning his own sock while he's wearing it. And he's also making reference to the fact that he wants to get out of there because he has to take his kid sister to the Philharmonic. That seems to have Dorothy Parker's fingerprints all over it.
Not surprisingly, it's not in the script.
Yes.
I don't know where they came up. They may have come up with it the day of. I have no idea.
And the other scene is where the same guy delivers a soda fountain drink to Pat, and he says, "Well, you're going to pay me, aren't you?" And she says, "Yeah, 15 cents. It's what we agreed on." I don't know where that came from, but it's just more weird stuff in this film, which makes it delightful. And with that, gentlemen, I will unshare my screen and toss it back to you.
Daniel, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Terrific,
And
Daniel. Thanks.
that was really terrific. And I'm glad you mentioned that weird shot with Otto Kruger, that long shot where he's talking about their sinister plans, because that whole soliloquy by him and even the patriotic response from the Cummings character was not in the script as of October 30th, 1941. So those were things that just grew with every subsequent draft.
But someone may have, said, well, we've just been bombed at Pearl Harbor. We have to fire up the audience a little bit because we're at war now. That's possible late in the shoot.
Yeah, and yet there's still this weirdness, this weird tone. I mean, even the symbolism of the circus characters, Hitchcock felt the symbolism was lost on a lot of people, but the the little man with the cigar was supposed to represent the Axis powers of Hitler, and the thin man was supposed to be FDR, and so on and so
The
forth.
Siamese twins who don't get along, those are European countries.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. Well, the dwarf at one point says, "I'm against voting." That sounds familiar, right?
Yeah, and so you've got, and you also did have some material that was tweaked a bit. In the film, the thin man says, when they're trying to vote, what do they do with these two people who have suddenly appeared out of nowhere? The thin man says, "Thank heaven we're still members of a democracy." In the script, it was take a vote. This is a representative democracy. The will of the majority must be observed. So it's a little, and also what I thought was fascinating, the script, when the Priscilla Lane character confronts Fry in the crown of the Statue of Liberty, I mean, she's blatantly admitting that she knows all about him and his sabotage work and his framing of Robert Cummings. He realizes she's Cummings' girl. He threatens to take, he basically says that if we're going to take him with us if they get us, they'll hang him, sister. Don't forget that, and I'll be alive and kicking when they do. That was in the screenplay, and then for the film, that was all pretty much removed, and she's instead quoting from the statue, "Bring us your poor," the Testament, which does not appear in the script.
He made the most of his about three minutes of screen time, Norman Lloyd, that he has.
He
that he has
did.
in the film.
He kind of has this presence over a majority of the narrative, even though we really only see him in the beginning and towards the end. But he has more, I think, more of an impact than some of the real adversaries do in the picture.
And he was with us till the age of 106. I guess definitively the very last, after Olivia de Havilland, member of that generation. The parade has really gone by, I guess, at this point. And for baseball fans, I wanted to read one brief Norman Lloyd related piece here from Todd McCarthy's obit.
Gary, just
Yes.
a brief timeout. Max, can you make Lori a host of this meeting? Her internet dropped out.
Oh my
Okay,
goodness.
let me see what I can do.
Yeah.
I will see what I can do.
Thank you. Okay, back to you, Gary.
Well, this concerns Norman Lloyd, who was, believe it or not, also a big baseball fan. And according to Todd McCarthy's column, he says here on October 25, 2017, 2 weeks short of his 103rd birthday, Norman was taken to Dodger Stadium to see his beloved Dodgers take on the Houston Astros in Game 2 of the World Series. This also made the news as the only previous series game that Norman had ever attended at age 12 was Game 1 of the 1926 World Series at Yankee Stadium, where the St. Louis Cardinals faced off against a hometown team led by Babe Ruth. That game, which the Yankees won 2-1, was notable for a slide into second base that split the Babe's pants. Oh, what a life. Has Lori been successfully restored?
Let's see. She's part of the group. Whether how much power she has in the meeting, I'm a little.
I just clicked on making her host. So
okay, great.
I hope that worked.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much. So the thing is, there are a couple of things in Saboteur that it touches that I thought were a little lame. I mean, it was kind of not subtle when the Cummings character is like waving his handcuffed hands in front of the uncle's face to make sure he's blind. The pointing to the book that says "escape" in the library, that was a little obvious, and I thought the Hitchcock seemed to be a little bit in a hurry, as the project was in general, because he really was eager to get away from Selznick and back in production. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on pluses and minuses.
As Hitchcock said to Truffaut, one of his problems with the film is that there was too much stuff in it, too many disparate ideas that didn't really hold together that well. But it does keep moving. And, it is a moving picture that moves from one coast to another. And I think it's one of his more entertaining films. Not a great masterpiece, but it holds up.
And his cameo is virtually impossible to see. It's like if you blink and you missed it. Isn't that right, Daniel?
Yeah, he's a patron at a newsstand and in Manhattan, and he's mostly turned away from the camera. So it's
I
hardly
timed
worth
it at
looking
3
for.
seconds. I found the clip, and they were literally on screen for 3 seconds. So
There you go.
you gotta really look fast.
According to Patrick McGilligan, who was one of the biographers for Hitchcock, there were 2 attempts made for a cameo by Hitch. One was he was supposed to be the couple that sees Bob Cummings and Priscilla Lane on the highway arguing, and then the woman says they must really be in love. That was supposed to be Dorothy Parker and Hitchcock. Hitchcock was supposed to be behind the wheel, and she was supposed to make the remark. They may have even filmed that, but they decided, that doesn't work. And then there was thought of him, I believe they may have filmed this as well, his cameo was supposed to be outside the soda fountain or drugstore, where apparently he's a deaf mute or something, and the studio thought that might offend people.
Well, either he claimed or somebody claimed, and what I read the last couple of days, that in that particular cameo, he is playing the husband of a deaf couple, and he makes some kind of obscene remark in sign language to his wife. And therefore the studio didn't like that, and they made him cut it or something.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that would be totally in character.
Hitch was always pushing the envelope there.
Well, I think one reason why Saboteur tends not to have as high a rating among Hitchcockians as some of the other big ones is because the very next film that followed was Shadow of a Doubt, which Hitchcock cited as his personal favorite. And whatever bumpiness was in the road along Saboteur in terms of the narrative, they resolved all those issues. Or obviously Shadow of a Doubt was a smoother narrative ride.
And then the very daring experiment of Lifeboat that came right after that, the same year as well. That was,
which once again, it points to that cynical phase of all these films, starting with Saboteur. I mean, Lifeboat is also a fairly, I think, really underrated. I think it's one of his best works.
yes.
But it's also a pretty cynical look at, although it rises to the occasion towards the end to be more of a uplifting war story. It's along the way, there's some pretty dark characterizations among the people we're supposed to sympathize with. But,
it raised a lot of hackles, and as he says in Hitchcock Truffaut, one of the leading columnists in New York gave the picture 3 days to get out of town. That was
for Lifeboat?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, do you think this would be a good time to consider taking some questions from and thoughts from our attendees?
Yes.
I think that we were also going to have Laurie come back in and show us the trailer, Max, of this great series you've got in the works before.
Right. I'll say, as Laurie's going to assist us with the questions and thoughts from you, the audience, but just a mention here that the third Tuesday of this month will start a monthly course for New Plaza that I will be teaching called Film Craft. And each week I'm going to be focusing on the different disciplines involved in making a motion picture. We'll be talking about the title design, we'll be talking about acting, cinematography, editing, set design, costume design, makeup, and music. And we'll be showing a lot of behind the scenes examples of these disciplines. We'll be, of course, returning to Hitchcock time and again. And just to get you in the mood for what's going to be part of that series.
Hey, Siri, call Sean.
Oh, we can hear you, Laurie. That's great.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I'm glad.
Guys, I'm going to apologize. My internet's gone klafooey. I'm not sure how to do the Q&A after. So if you could just bear with me, I'm trying
no
to
worries, and we're here to help.
Okay.
We're a team effort here at New Plaza Cinema. So let's take a look at the trailer for the Film Craft series, which I'll be teaching this course. Sean Moore is going to have more information about how to sign up for that class later on. And now we'll be happy to take questions and thoughts from the audience. We're going to make this this Zoom experience work if it hurts. But one way to start is if you have you can raise your hand, and we'll ask you to unmute and turn on your video. And please don't be shy. I know New Plaza people always are eager to share their questions and thoughts.
And I believe Max also clicked the participant box right there.
Let's see. Oh yeah, because we can also there are, let's see, some people, we can also if you have chat comments you'd like to put in chat, that's great. One person writes that she loved how the circus performers wanted to be democratic and vote on whether to hide the couple or not. Once again, that's the political symbolism. And there's also a link from Sean on the Filmcraft link as well.
I'm scrolling through the participants and I don't see any raised hands.
I know, such shyness.
What's going on here?
Well, Daniel, it's because you're usually in the audience and you always start us off with a question.
Yeah.
I was kind of hoping Ann Logan would raise her hand because she had some interesting comments at the beginning in comments. So
actually, well, you know what? I see Nina Sweet has raised her hand. Nina, you're welcome to turn on your video, or if you could just want to ask your question, that's fine too.
Yeah, I had always read about Alfred Hitchcock's neurosis from childhood of claustrophobia or being locked in a small space. There was a story that his father, to punish him, sort of half jokingly put him in a jail cell. I don't know if you read that, but that he really had this claustrophobic feeling for most of his life. And I think this is reflected in most of his films, wanting to escape, wanting to free himself, free the hero from enclosures. Are you aware of that?
I think there definitely is a theme there that you're identifying, Nina. The story you're referring to is the one that was his wind-up anecdote in interviews. He would say, you know, my father sent me with a note to the police, the constable on the corner, and I was put in a jail cell for 5 minutes.
Yes.
And that's what we do to naughty boys. And then that became his go-to anecdote about his father. But then apparently, I think it was according to in McGilligan's biography, Hitchcock later wasn't even sure that happened. But it certainly does question his thoughts on his father. But I think there is claustrophobia in a lot of themes in his films. I think that's an astute observation.
And I think it's also reflective of a built-in fear of authority and the police.
And police, absolutely.
I mean, how many Hitchcock films are the police the enemy of the protagonist? It happens quite a bit.
The Wrong Man being, I think, one of the most powerful examples. Absolutely.
39 Steps, North by Northwest, all of these people in flight reflect Hitchcock's own fear of the police.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask Ann Logan to unmute, and please share your question with us, Ann.
Actually very disappointed in this movie. I know that you all think it's wonderful, but I found it extremely disjointed. I thought the plotting was not connective. What they were able to do during certain periods made no sense. Most of the characters to me were not fully drawn. And it was very, very jingoistic. Several people commented that they thought that because it didn't mention the names of the countries, that it was forwarding. But there was no reason why I believed in any of the characters' viewpoints in terms of being against the country, our country, their country, whatever. There just simply was no motivation in this movie at all. It was just a chase scene to me, and one that didn't make sense.
So it sounds like you were picking up on, it seemed as though the political motivations of the characters were almost irrelevant. It was the chase that really mattered. And the political situation was almost an excuse to get from one set piece to another. That sounds like what you
But it
picked
was
up on.
distracting.
Yeah,
Yeah, but I found it incredibly distracting. If you're going to make a chase movie, go ahead and make a chase movie. There were so many times when there could have been an opportunity to show actually how they got into a particular scene and how they got out of a particular scene. But instead, they would waste time in the movie with a pronouncement that came out of nowhere as to, I mean, for instance, when he's off at the pool and the little kid pulls out the things, and all of a sudden he says, well, yes, I know that you saw those things from the, it was just one thing after another that didn't carry on.
I think you're picking also up on the fact that the rushed nature of the project in general, it didn't quite have the gestation process that some of his more popular films had. That maybe had they had a little bit more time, they could have worked some of these things out. I don't know if you gentlemen have any more to add on that, but thank you very much on that, Anne. That's a very interesting observation. Lee Honickman, I see your hand is up. And you can turn on, oh, I'm going to ask you, sorry, Lee, I'm asking you to unmute. Go right ahead and you can turn on your video if you like.
Okay. When I got to the point in watching the movie where I felt as Anne did, exactly, I then concentrated on trying to find Alfred Hitchcock.
Oh.
I mean, I had it's like when I used to listen to Koch make speeches, I used to count how many ums he said before I could think about what he was actually saying. So I was looking for Alfred Hitchcock and we could not.
You got to look fast. You got to look fast.
I wonder if any, you know what we did? We Googled it and it said within 65 minutes of the movie, he was there.
That's
and
right.
Yes, Gary, very fast.
Yes.
But I do agree a lot with what Anne had to say.
Well, it's funny because I'm ashamed to say the last time I saw this, let's just say it was 1981, a long time ago. And I remember not thinking much of it and being let down, et cetera, and then being pleasantly surprised when I watched it this week. I thought, this is fun. So I had gotten low expectations and then was enjoying it.
Do you think that one of the reasons you might have liked it better this time was because we're living in a very strange society at this point?
You know, it is fascinating when you're watching films set during the Depression of the 30s, when the economy is bad. It resonates with things today. When you're watching stuff, the wartime years and the political tensions, it resonates. These films do affect us differently. I think there's something to be said for that and something you pick up on.
I can understand that.
And Anne had mentioned the jingoistic nature, which was low key compared to so many other films that came out the same year. Oh my word, this is almost very, very low key in that regard.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lee.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was a great conversation.
Appreciate your participation. Marilyn Alterman, you have a question or a thought you'd like to share? Go right ahead, and if you want to turn your video on, go right ahead.
Actually, I'm probably now in the minority because I got a lot out of this movie. I hadn't seen it in a million years. And I gave it leeway. I gave it leeway considering it was filmed in 1942. And maybe people are used to other things, having seen hundreds of millions of movies since that time. But what chilled me most, very chilling, was the scene in the Sutton house. Because I had just finished reading the New Yorker article by Jane Mayer about dark money in politics.
Yeah.
And this was so relevant because you had all these wealthy people who are the cream of society. Everybody bows down to them, and they're the dark money paying for the saboteur to go out and do all these things. So I was I just love the film, and you have to give it a little leeway. I mean, it was 1942. It's a little corny. I found it very funny at times. I laughed out loud. I loved it. Thank you.
I was, thank you very much, Marilyn, because when I was watching the Sutton House scene, that definitely stood out for me from movies from Hollywood made at this time, because that was suggesting that there were a lot of very affluent Americans who were pretty much on the side of the Axis powers. And that was pretty subversive, which is why I think more needs to be written about Hitchcock's subversive nature during this time, because thank you for pointing that out. Great.
And some of them, of course, had no clue that they were contributing to that operation as well.
Exactly.
A comment in and of itself, perhaps.
Who didn't have a clue? I missed that part.
I think some of the people in that party did not have a clue what they were contributing to, like that admiral who takes over as the MC at one point.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it was shocking, actually.
Wonderful point, Marilyn. Thank you so much. And thank you. And I'm going to ask Carolyn, I'm going to unmute you, and Carolyn Ma, please go right ahead.
Yes, I just want to know, how long did it take to make that movie?
The actual production time, I don't have.
Amazingly short, because I happen to notice in that business about the lawsuit by Bob Cummings against Universal Pictures, he started filming in December of 1941, the middle of the month. And in April of 1942, 4 months later, the picture was finished and premiered in Washington, D.C. with 80 U.S. senators and over 150 congressmen in attendance, as well as Hitchcock and the leading members of the cast. So that's 4 months, which was not uncommon for big assembly line studio productions in those days. But today that would be shocking for a film of any consequence to get on screen that quickly.
Was it within their budget, or did they go over the budget? Like, you know,
that I'm not sure of.
Because Daniel, he had to do some cost cutting, as you pointed out. Yeah.
Hitchcock, once again on loan from his evil puppet master Selznick, presented a plan to Universal with a lot more scenes and extras and sets, and he had to cut back on that. And that's part of what I was referring to in some of the trick photography, if you will, that he used with painted backdrops and such.
I doubt if at Universal Pictures in those days, many films went over budget.
Although it is, you almost have to feel sorry for studio heads dealing with Hitchcock, because when you check some of the schedules, the shooting schedules for a lot of his work, he was not known for staying on schedule or budget. I mean, he was, in Vertigo, I know, went over and went over and went over, and they sort of let him alone, but I'm sure they were feeling a little anxious, and this could have been a case as well with Universal. But as Gary said, that's very quick turnaround time, 4 months. That's very, for a Hitchcock picture in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Diane Reed, I'm going to unmute you, and please share your question or thoughts with us. Go right ahead.
There I am. Hi. I don't usually ask questions at movie talks, because I just enjoy everybody else's opinion. But I've seen this movie several times, and there is pros and cons to it. This one I'll leave with the three gentlemen. When Robert Cummings and Priscilla Lane end up in Soda City, all of a sudden the shack appears. They're inside, they find a radio. Two men come in. He hides her in the other room, and when he goes to look for her, she's gone. The next time you see her, where is she? She's with the sheriff. So how did she get there?
While we're at it, how did Cummings get out of the mansion after he started the fire?
Yeah.
And I think the writer asked Hitchcock about that, and Hitchcock said the audience will never know. So.
Yeah, well, as he was fond of saying, we'll have to leave that to our friends, the plausibles.
That's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Marilyn, I'm unmuting you, and we'd love to hear. I can. I'm trying to unmute Marilyn, and there we go. And you can turn your video on if you like.
Yes.
That's fine. I was wondering, actually, somewhere along the same thing, because what I kept seeing as a kind of sort of subplot that was very comic was the way they would come together and then they would come apart because, for example, when they're in the circus bus, he hides somewhere. We see her and the police see her, but we don't see him and we don't know where he's gone. The same thing happens in the scene that was just referred to, in which we wonder, are they going to find her because she had been hiding in that room? This happens a number of times in which they come together and then they go apart and go their different ways and then they come together. It seems quite deliberate, and I was wondering about sort of these comings and goings. I had the expectation always, okay, so how are they going to do it this time around?
Well, one thing I can share for you, Marilyn, is in the circus truck, there is a shot where they show that he had been hiding up above something, almost like an upper berth in the truck, and they pull him out of there. So that is explained. But, Hitchcock, did he really want to show every single movement that every character had? You have, in a movie of finite length, you can't show them going to the drugstore and getting ammunition for their pistol, for example. So,
well, it seemed like a deliberate style. It seemed like a deliberate trope that this is the way they would do this couple. Then they're sort of coming up together and then being pulled apart in some bizarre way. And then meeting again and so on and so forth. It just struck me as quite something that was a little bit more deliberate.
Oh, that's, it's because he often dealt with such fantastical elements in his narratives that there has to be some, making that plausible and logical, I know has got to be a challenge for the writers. But thank you, Marilyn. And Patricia has a question. That may be our last question. But go right ahead, Patricia. You can turn your video on if you like.
On a more superficial level, I really enjoyed watching the film in HD. I usually watch movies the way they were supposed to be, but this time I watched it in HD and there was so much detail. The cinematography really stood out, the black and white contrast, and the sets in the mansion in particular were just spectacular, the detail. The hallway, the room where they all were in, all of the design was just really terrific. And I don't think I would have noticed it if it hadn't been in HD. And I've seen the film without HD, but this time it just was like, more fun to watch, more detail.
May I ask, Patricia, were you watching it on a Blu-ray DVD or streaming? How
I streamed it on the Criterion channel.
Okay.
And there was such a big difference with everything. Even the opening scene where you see the cafeteria shot just before they all get off work, and the shot of the inside of the airplane factory was really incredible. And then there was also a really great scene in the desert where they're stopped by the policeman and his motorcycle just kind of glistens. It was very, and I think it was the HD that brought all of that out. So visually for me, I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And yeah, so I thought I'd mention it.
It's very encouraging. It shows that Universal Studios, a company that for many years was not really one of the leading studios who seemed to care about film preservation or their heritage or whatever, black suits and black hearts, they were referred to in some corners of the business, but they've actually taken very good care of the materials of their catalog films, and now it's paying off with a remastering like this.
It's terrific. Nina, did you have a follow-up question?
I did.
Go right ahead. Go right ahead, Nina. Oh, I'm going to ask you to unmute. There you go.
Okay. My granddaughter just started film school at San Diego State University. She was originally interested in production design, and now it's directing. So because you are such experts here, I just wanted to ask, your opinion. Everything is so computer generated and futuristic in movie making today. How much will the great Hitchcocks and the Fords and the Howard Hawks, how much would you think academia will still have the material on the backgrounds of these great auteurs to provide the young film students for today? Because everything is so comic book oriented. I mean, even when I hear her talk, there's so much fantasy and futurism and all of that. What is the future of the influence, the continuing influence of the great auteurs?
I'll weigh in. It's a heavy question. I mean, we're in a country without a past, and so every teacher and educator is faced with what seems to be an insurmountable challenge of trying to make sure that younger generations are aware of these things in the arts. And film, it's very difficult because it's not a requirement in universities. It's often an elective course, film history, and the arts often are in general. And it's just a matter of trying to get more of these programs seen by new generations. But it's a challenge, and I'm sure Gary and Daniel would.
Well, I think that the directors we mentioned, their films are always going to be available in some way or another for those who want to seek them out. I think if you Google it, I happen to come across, a typically eloquent quote from Martin Scorsese this past week, where he said some young people asked him, well, why should we really be interested in old movies? Right. And he gave a very cogent and passionate response, saying that he constantly goes back to them for inspiration, for instruction, that there's always something to be learned. And under the stress of picture making, this is always something of value to him. And I'm sure your daughter will find that stress in whatever area of the business she works in, and will need periodic inspiration. And we would say, there it is.
Right. And I would point out that people are still putting on productions of Shakespeare. And, some of these things never die. And frankly, the three of us are here to keep all this alive. So you're talking to the choir.
Beautifully stated, Daniel. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Nita. I'm afraid we're out of time. If Sean is around, Sean, I know you'd like to perhaps close things out, or go right ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a great discussion as usual. I'm super excited about stuff that we have coming up. So Max already mentioned Filmcraft, the series that he's going to do, but I want to talk a little bit about that and how it's a little bit different than our normal lectures. First of all, it's 9 programs, 9 months in a row, once a month, pieced together to help really understand how films are crafted. But in addition to this, we'll be sending out pre-work for each session. So Max has got suggested readings, films to watch, etc., to really prepare you for the topic beforehand. And then also we'll follow up with a post quiz to really help reinforce the learnings that took place with that session. So you're going to see it a little bit more robust than our typical lecture that we do. It really is more of a course. And so I wanted to mention that there are links for both the first individual one and the full group in the comments. If you're interested in checking those out, they're always on Eventbrite. You can Google or check out our Eventbrite channel and see all of our programs. But I also want to mention the 18th and the 22nd of August. So Wednesday the 18th, Max is doing a lecture on the blacklist in Hollywood that is going to be very, very interesting, and I hope that you can join that. But on the 22nd, Sunday, we're going to be doing a talk back about the film The Breaking Point, which stars the great John Garfield, who was blacklisted and died very young, really related to that blacklisting process. But we're very pleased to announce that his daughter, Julie Garfield, is going to be joining us as guest host. And so we're very excited about that. Once a quarter, we put on a special talk back to raise funds as a fundraiser, and this is one of those. And so we do ask for a donation for this event, but I think it's one that you won't want to miss, and that it'll be very, very interesting. So with that said, we hope that you can join some of these events. We're looking forward to them. Thank you for joining us today. It was a fun discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Dan.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys. This is great fun.
Have a great week, everyone. See you soon.